Here we go. So today we are going to talk about a woman who exemplifies how women could have multiple roles in their lives. And there's this kind of narrative that women just worked at home or managed the domestic side of things, but that's really not always true. And a woman who shows us that is Katherine Fenkyll. She's today's woman, and she was a draper. And a draper was somebody who sold cloth. It could be cloth generally for clothing, but it could also be for sails, like on a boat, or any kind of thing that you use cloth for. A draper would be your person who would probably sell that to you. Now, Katherine exemplifies the ways in which marriage was really seen as a partnership sometimes, and wives were really expected to share in the work of their husband's trades. And some could even parlay that into being really major players in London industry. Of course, this wasn't the norm, so there were actually only 73 women apprentices listed in the 16th century in London, and there were thousands and thousands of men. And there normally wasn't anything legal that was going against women practicing a trade, or it was called something called freedom of the city. When you applied to practice your trade in the city, it was the freedom of the city. And there was nothing barring women from that legally, but it just wasn't so much that women did it. Although by 1550, there was an ordinance in the Weavers' Company, and that stated that no weaver could reveal his trade to any woman or maiden. So that was on the books by 1550, but that was just the Weavers' Company too. So, there weren't that many specific laws. It was just something that wasn't really done. There were areas of work where it was totally appropriate for women to enter and to be part of. The cloth trade was one of those. You could work in spinning or even dressmaking, totally respectable for women to do. And you could get apprenticeships that way as well. So that was something that was quite common for women to do. It's interesting also to note that at this time, women wives didn't have any kind of legal status apart from their husbands. They couldn't own any property or really anything. Anything they had, their shoes, their clothing, their jewelry, anything they brought to the marriage became their husbands as well and belonged to their husbands. Now, the flip side of that was that they couldn't be sued. So any debts that they incurred, that was on their husband, but any wages that they made also belonged to their husband. So that was kind of the legal status of women at that time. So let's look at Katherine. She's our aforementioned draper, Katherine Fenkyll. Nothing is really known of her early life, and I can't find any images of her, of course, but she demonstrated a common path for women entrepreneurs, and this was to take over their husband's business once he had died. She likely left home sometime towards the end of the 15th century, right around when Margaret Beaufort was enjoying her life of quiet contemplation and retirement and content as the king's mother. So right around that time, Katherine Fenkyll is leaving home. She married a draper, Sir John Fenkyll, between 1497 and 1499. She was his second wife, and her husband was actually really at the center of trade in London. He was regularly part of official business. He voted in city elections. He served as an alderman from 1485 until the time that he died, and he was also the sheriff of London at one point. He represented the city of London in Parliament, and he was knighted and received a coat of arms. So this was a really good match for Katherine. And like I said, we don't know anything of her early life. So she might have come from very humble beginnings, although to marry someone like him, probably similar. But it was still a really good match that threw her right into the center of the glamour and glitz of London life, which even then was glitzy and glamorous. There wasn't the West End so much in the city. But, it was still quite glamorous. There were banquets and all kinds of stuff like that. So, Sir John was a draper, like I said, and he sold cloth. He also bought and sold iron goods, and he imported wine. He was really active. He had a really good sense of what was going to sell and what wasn't. There's some people who just look at something and say, oh, I could sell that. And that's what Sir John was. Once he went to Portugal on a business trip, and he brought home with him a barrel of marmalade, knowing that he could sell it. He owned ships, and he sometimes sold his cloth on the continent in those ships that he owned, or other times he rented ships. So he was very, very busy and, had a lot of irons in the fire and a lot going on. Katherine would have worked with her husband, assisting him and kind of learning the ropes, learning the contacts, learning the contracts, everything that he did. But she had no independent role in the business at this point. That being said, with the legal status and everything, women could have some sense of autonomy. Yesterday we talked about Margaret Beaufort being considered a femme sole at the end of her life. And according to the City of London, if a woman was married but, quote, followed any craft within the said city by herself apart, with which the husband in no way intermeddles, unquote, she could be, quote, bound as a single woman as to all that concerns her said craft. So if she were sued, she would be treated as a femme sole, and while women didn't have any separate legal status, they could enter contracts like that on their own if it was proven that the men didn't really know anything about or intermeddle in their business. So it was possible for women to have that kind of level of autonomy. But for Katherine, she was working with her husband, and her chance to kind of come out into the light was in 1499 when her husband died. Sir John had left her in charge of his business affairs. He must have really trusted her because they had only been married for a couple of years. She was still very young in terms of their marriage. They'd only been married for a few years. So he left her in charge. He named her one of the 3 executors of his estate. Childless widows were entitled to half of the husband's money and goods, but Sir John also left her a life interest in their home, land outside of London, and the remainder of his estate. And being an executor, she was dealing with the administration of this complex set of contracts and work. So it really showed that he trusted her and that he knew she was smart. He had requested that 2 of his associates who wanted to use his ships could do so for 3 years after his death, as long as they paid all the charges, the fees for it, and they would receive a third of the profit, with the remaining 2/3 going to Katherine. And at the end of those 3 years, the ship was to pass to the executor of the will. So she became a very wealthy widow, and she had no need to get involved in the Draper's business. She could have lived a very contented life working with the charities. Her husband left a lot of money for different charities, and for the good of his soul, she could have spent her time working on that. She had a large house. So there was really a lot that she could have done in her retirement, but she didn't. She set up her own business selling cloth and her own trading business with goods sailing all over the foreign ports, distant ports, all over the place. She had ships going and trading. So like I said, she was an executor, and in the time immediately after Sir John's death, she spent her time handling his affairs, his estate affairs. And that was a lot of work. They were still handling debts of his a decade later. So it was a lot of work to figure all of that out. His nephew, Sir John's nephew, had brought a case against her saying that he should have received more of the estate. He even claimed her house, and then she went to court saying that he had imagined this claim. So she really stuck up for what she knew she was owed. And she also engaged 2 male apprentices in 1511 and 1513. And then by 1515, we see her in court bringing a case before the Draper's Company about a silk that she had bought from the wife of a man called Matthew Boughton. She said that the silk was, quote, non-lawful and not after the sample. Basically that the sample didn't match what she was actually sold. So, she was becoming very active, having apprentices, which wasn't cheap. She had to pay for the apprentices. She bought them their freedom of the city. So it was an investment for her to have the apprentices. So it showed that she was really doing well and she was active. She was single for 12 years before she married again in 1511. So she had 12 years to really build up her business, build up her reputation. And it seems like the man that she married, this match was actually a love match, which is kind of sweet. He was well connected in the Draper's Company, and he had been a member of Parliament. And of course, this had been a gamble for her. She had over a decade of freedom, and she really enjoyed the status of being a widow of a knight. But She did love him, and she moved immediately into his home. And she, as we see from the way she was still running her business in 1511 and 1513, taking on these apprentices, she was still running her business and she didn't give up on that. She's a woman who spent 30 years as part of the drapery business. And her identity, while it certainly was a wife, she spent more time not as a wife than as a wife. And she always had her identity wrapped up in her business and took it very, very seriously, as we can see from the different court cases. And she protected her money, she protected her business. And it's really kind of inspirational to see this woman navigating through this world that we think of as very masculine, having these men coming to her saying, your husband owed me money, and her really standing strong and saying, well, I'm not going to pay it if I don't know. And it shows us a couple of things. It shows us that women could do this. Women were doing this. It wasn't that unusual. I mean, it wasn't the norm, but it wasn't that unusual. And also, that there was a role for women to stick up for themselves and to stick up for what they were owed. And I don't know. I find it very inspirational, these stories of people like her that were just doing this thing, living their life, having a business, and kicking ass, really, which is kind of why I want to talk about her, because she was pretty awesome. So